Hey there, I'm Lara, astrology maven. Welcome to my channel where I talk about the astrology that's playing out for all of us and for you individually. And right now I'm doing videos every couple of weeks talking about the new and full moons. So today the subject is the upcoming partial lunar eclipse in Taurus that's happening on November 19th, because a lunar eclipse is a full moon. And but not just any old full moon, right? So we're going to talk about that in this video. We're going to talk about the significant players in relation to this eclipse and eclipses in general, and we're going to talk about where this is hitting your own chart. We're going to take it through all 12 signs like I always do and speak to what you might expect from this this eclipse and the upcoming eclipse cycle that's happening. So this video will take you from November 17th through to the 30th, 2021. This is the waning part of the moon cycle, right? So we have the full moon that we're going to talk about. In this case, it's an eclipse. And then we have the moon waning towards the next new moon that is happening, which also happens to be an eclipse. So I'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about that, which is a solar eclipse in Sagittarius in that case. But so in this video, we are going to talk about the Friday, November 19th, partial lunar eclipse in the sign of Taurus. That's happening at 3:57 a.m. And that is Eastern Standard Time. So you can adjust for your time zone. Like I mentioned to you, this is a lunar eclipse, which is a full moon. All lunar eclipses are full moons, which means the sun and the moon are across the sky from each other. They are in this conversation of tension, right, if you will. And this particular eclipse happens at 27 degrees of the fixed earth sign of Taurus, and it is in a T-square. So the sun and the moon are both in a 90-degree angle with Jupiter in Aquarius. So we're going to talk about that. And then we also have this eclipse conjoining, so right beside, right on top of the fixed star Algol. So I'm going to spend a minute on that as well. Although I don't often talk about fixed stars in my videos, sometimes certain things are worth kind of going outside the norm and addressing, and that happens to be the case here with Algol in this eclipse. So right before I break down the eclipse for you, I just want to talk about one other thing that is happening as this video is coming out. So I'm recording this video on November 16th, and we are coming up on an exact opposition between Mars and Scorpio and Uranus and Taurus. It actually goes exact on November 17th, which is the day this video comes out. So this, as I wrote about yesterday on both Facebook and Instagram, and you can check out what I wrote if you want by going over there. The links are always below. But this is like Mars is the flamethrower and Uranus is the lightning bolt, right? And they're kind of head on in this opposition. And we have had a lot of Uranus action because all the planets moving through Scorpio during Scorpio season, the Sun, Mercury, Mars, are all coming into this opposition with Uranus and Taurus, right? And of course, Uranus is one of the major players this year in that on and off square with Saturn that we've talked about sort of, consistently. That Saturn-Uranus square that is the defining signature, right, of 2021. So Uranus is a major player, and all of these planets are coming through Scorpio and they are opposing Uranus. And as a result, it has been an interesting Scorpio season, has it not? So one of the things that I wanted to just mention to you, in case you hadn't seen it, and it was an astrologer friend of mine, Nicole, thanks Nicole, if you see this, who pointed this out, and it's this article about how there was a major weather event. There was a big storm in Egypt, and I can't remember the name of the place. It starts with an A, the particular place. But there was this storm, and it caused all of these, like a swarm of scorpions to come out of the ground, right? Out of their nests, I guess, and some snakes too. And these scorpions just scattered, and they actually, you know, caused mayhem, and they stung about, I think the story said something like 450 or 480 people were stung by scorpions, and 3 or 4 of them actually died as a result. And they actually had to call health professionals off of taking care of COVID patients because they needed these people to help with all of the people who had been stung by the scorpions, and they needed to actually get more anti-venom and all of this, right? So terrifying, right? In some ways, unless you're a super fan of scorpions, but nevertheless, I don't think anybody wants to be subjected to that. So, you know, it was so fascinating, this story, because it just reflects the astrology so perfectly. Like, you cannot make this shit up. It's just wild sometimes. You know, we've got this during Scorpio season, right? This swarm of scorpions, you know, and all these planets with this, you know, opposing Uranus, the disruptor, the planet of surprises and shock and awe in the sign, the earth sign of Taurus. And we have this swarm of scorpions literally coming out of the earth, and then, you know, spreading. There's the square to Jupiter piece, and wreaking havoc, right? So very, very interesting stuff. And I actually, if you want to read about the story, like I said, I posted the actual link on Facebook, and I referred to it on Instagram as well. So it will be over there. So I was saying to you, it's like Mars opposite Uranus is like the flamethrower and the lightning bolt kind of thing. And so we can see things, a lot of different things, but just to put it very succinctly, we can see the whole range of how this sort of archetype can play out from, or these archetypes in combination, you know, acts of heroism potentially to acts of destruction. And so, you know, it's a good time to really remember to breathe, remember to respond rather than react. And, you know, just remember this too shall pass. But this is all part of the eclipse story, and which really, really, you know, was kind of initiated by the Scorpio new moon that we had on November 4th, right? And we talked, you can go back and watch that video if you want. So that's kind of where things kind of got off the ground here. And at this lunar eclipse on the 19th, we are, in some ways, that part of the cycle is reaching a culmination because it's a full moon, and all full moons are sort of culminations, right? They are points of release, of culmination, of things coming to a head or a peak, and also of things being illuminated. And I think in this particular case, you know, this eclipse is a transitional eclipse because it is the first eclipse in the sign of Taurus, so on that Taurus-Scorpio axis, and there will be, it's triggering this 18-month cycle, right? And so in this case, whatever happens around the time of this full moon lunar eclipse is likely to kind of shine a light on our trajectory over the next 18 months, whether that be collectively and or personally. And it's always going to depend, like how personally these things play out for you always depends on how they are interacting with your own personal chart. So if your chart is really being triggered strongly, and we'll get into some of those pieces as we move through the video here, how would you know that, right? Then you're likely to feel this and have a more sort of personal, potent experience around it. If it's not really being triggered at all, then you're likely to see these energies play out in the world around you, or maybe in the people's lives, around you, kind of thing. So that's how that works. But as I was saying, this eclipse is sort of a transition point, because we are coming out of one 18-month cycle where the eclipses have been happening on the Gemini Sagittarius axis, right? And we have one more eclipse in Sagittarius. So one more eclipse to finish off that cycle, which is happening on December 4th. And that is a new moon eclipse. And I'll be back in 2 weeks' time to talk about that. But so there's this overlap here, and that's what happens when eclipses are sort of transitioning from one axis to the next, right? And the nodes of the moon, incidentally, which are heavily implicated in eclipses, they always move in retrograde. They always move in reverse. So the nodes in this case are moving from Sagittarius, Gemini, backwards through Taurus and Scorpio. So a lunar eclipse, right, happens when the moon passes into the Earth's shadow. And this particular lunar eclipse, it's a partial one, so it won't be completely in shadow, but it is quite a long one. And in fact, like, it's going to be visible for about 6 hours, I think I read. And that hasn't happened for like 580 years or something, right? Close to 600 years that hasn't happened. It will be visible in, I wrote it on my notes here. It will be visible in North and South America. So Canada, the US, Mexico, Australia, Northwest Africa, the Arctic, and much of Europe and Asia. So visible in quite a few places, actually. And of course, when we're talking about looking at eclipses, you have to take precautions. Also, I'm just going to say that if you're somebody that is into ritual around the moon cycles, which I'm one of those people, I tend to steer clear of doing that kind of work around eclipses. Eclipses they're turning points. They are, it's like when the wheel of fate turns, right? And we can maybe think that we have an idea of where things are headed, but we don't necessarily know. And so it's kind of one of those times where it's best to take a step back, to just kind of let things play out. Now, that's not to say that if you have things that you have to address in your own life, and don't we all, right? But that you should avoid those. I'm just saying that, around the day or two around the actual eclipse may not be the time for initiating any big new thing or anything like that. But, life goes on, and we have to do what we have to do when we have to do it. So just, it's good to be mindful is all. Now, I'm going to show you the chart first before I break down the individual pieces. So here's the chart where we can see the sun in Scorpio at 27 degrees up here, pretty close to Mercury at 21 Scorpio. And there is Mars in Scorpio as well, right across the sky from Uranus, as I was talking about a minute ago. And then we have the moon right opposite the sun at 27 degrees of Taurus, very close to the North Node in Gemini. So pretty soon these nodes are going to move, and the North Node will move into Taurus. And the South Node up here will move into Scorpio, right? And then we have Jupiter up here in Aquarius making a 90-degree angle to both the moon and the sun. So that's what we call a T-square. So that's what it looks like on the chart. And let's break it down now and talk about the individual pieces. And one that I didn't even mention to you because it's not on the chart, but we're going to talk about the fixed star Algol as well. First of all, let's talk about the square to Jupiter, the T-square to Jupiter. So Jupiter in Aquarius is in this 90-degree angle to the sun and the moon. And that's what we call a square. And a square is a conversation of some tension. It's a dynamic conversation. It's a conversation that requires some action to move through the tension. Squares are of the nature of the planet Mars, right? So dynamic and willful and determined and potentially agitating and assertive and aggressive and those kinds of qualities, right? So when we have a square, we usually some action has to happen to resolve the tension. And in this case, it's Jupiter that's in square to the sun and the moon. So when Jupiter is involved, Jupiter is the great benefic. So this is, generally far, how shall I word it? It's preferred to have the involvement of a benefic planet like Jupiter or Venus, rather than, a planet that is a malefic, one of the malefics like Saturn or Mars. So, but they also have their place. So I'm not trying to villainize any particular planet, but Jupiter is known as the great benefic, right? And so we can see an opportunity here for growth. Jupiter can bring buoyancy to the situation and upliftment. But on the flip side, Jupiter also has this tendency to expand whatever it comes into contact with, right? So it can cause extremism. It can cause over exuberance, over exertion. It can cause our expectations to be out of whack with reality. So, that's the caution here kind of thing, that if you are looking to a situation and you're really putting all your eggs in that basket, let's just put it that way, then you might want to just tone your expectations down a little, because it's not to say it's like, it's not going to play out well. Jupiter is a benefic planet. It's just that it may not end up being the full out sort of party or all your dreams come true that you imagine. Then again, it might be. What do I know? But I'm just speaking to the astrology here. So, that's a word of advice. Just keep your expectations reasonable. And then when we do that, we tend to, not be so, like, we tend to not be kind of totally bummed out or disappointed if things don't go exactly our way. We can still see the good, right? Even though maybe it's not as good as we had hoped. So the next thing I want to talk about here is this fixed star Algol that is in conjunction to the this eclipse. So fixed star Algol, and it doesn't show on this particular software that I used here, so I didn't show it to you on the chart, but it sits in the sky at 26 degrees of Taurus. That's where Algol sits. And like I mentioned, I don't usually talk about fixed stars, but I thought it was very relevant here to mention this and necessary, because obviously it is like right there, right on the eclipse point. And so it's worth mentioning, and it's worth giving a heads up about. So Algol is an infamous star, and it is part of the constellation Perseus. So it goes by a couple of names, Algol being one of them. It's also known as the demon star and Medusa's head as well. So here's the thing. When I did some research on this, as is usually the case, I discovered that even though Algol has been associated with some not so pleasant things, over time, we probably have missed a lot of the The more I hesitate to use the phrase the lighter side of Algol because I'm not sure that's appropriate in this case, but it's all that comes to mind. But essentially, what's happened, as is often the case, is that because of the patriarchal, system that we live in and have been living for very, very long time, a lot of things are not what they appear to be, or a lot of things are vilified, that really aren't all bad. So that's kind of the case with Algol. And when I was looking at some of the articles and the mythology and stuff, and reading about Medusa, I discovered that in ancient times, right? So pre-patriarchy, Medusa was a symbol of female power and wisdom. And then history happened and all that changed. So to make a long story short, and I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to go and do some of your own reading. But in a nutshell, the story of Medusa, and I'm just going to tell you, there's a bit of a trigger warning here, right? And I'm going to keep it brief. But Medusa was raped, and then, as is often the case, had the whole incident blamed on her, right? And so she ended up being beheaded. First, her hair was turned into snakes, and there's some indication that those were originally dreadlocks, actually. So you can read up about that on your own, but things were, history has a tendency of warping things and vilifying things and all of that. So anyways, her hair full of snakes, her head full of snakes, she ended up being beheaded. And so, long story short, there is this association with Algol with that kind of violence, and with losing one's head, essentially, right? Take that for what you will. Bernadette Brady, who's done a lot of work, she's an astrologer that's done a lot of work on the fixed stars. She, I pulled a couple of quotes from her, and so she says that Algol seems to contain immense female passion and power. And also, Algol represents a strong consuming passion that may devour you with anger and rage. So it's a similar, like in my mind, I was reading about this and I'm thinking, like, this sounds like some other energies that we have been cluing into over these last few years with the astrology. One of those being Aries, right? The goddess of discord and chaos. And I've spoken about her in the past, and she is sitting right around 24 degrees of Capricorn right now. But it's that similar kind of dark feminine energy that has been really used and abused and vilified over the centuries of patriarchy. So in my research, I sort of came to the conclusion that Algol is an energy that won't allow us to ignore pain and suffering, right? So the pain and suffering in our own lives, in the lives of people around us, the pain and suffering in the world, the pain and suffering of the planet, all of these things, right? Particularly as Algol sitting in the earth sign of Taurus right now, or not right now, but in that, at that 26 degree Taurus mark is where Algol sits. And so there is this, I feel like there is a real connection there to, the to the earth and the pain and suffering that's been inflicted on Mother Earth. So Algol kind of forces us to confront these issues and, you know, and these difficult realities sort of thing in one way or another. And so I know that those are not things that I've spoken about this before. And I think I even kind of talked about this in my last video, but I know that those are things that a lot of people would rather not face. They'd rather not go there, especially after the last couple years we've had. Oh my, you know, we're all at the end of our rope. And so, you know, we don't want to kind of face these things, but the bottom line is, you can't heal what you refuse to acknowledge, right? That's the thing. So, doesn't mean you have to marinate in it, but, you know, you can't heal what you refuse to acknowledge. You can't do anything about it, period, when you refuse to acknowledge it. So the other thing I just wanted to mention to you that I thought was interesting is that Algol comes from the word alcohol, actually, which, and that word alcohol is known as demon in Arabic. So I thought that was interesting, and I was pondering this for a little while and the significance of that. And, you know, so I was thinking to myself, well, you know, when we're talking about alcohol, spirits, right? That's another name for it. And if we indulge every so often and we have a little, you know, we may relax, we might unwind a little, we might have some animated conversations and some laughs, and we might even, you know, there might be even a little necessary truth telling that happens. But if we take it too far, right, if we indulge too much, what happens? Well, we make bad decisions, and we can, those decisions can sometimes have dire consequences. We have no self-control, and we can cause damage to ourselves and to others. And, you know, we can lose our heads. That's the effect. So there is this association, right, of Algol with Medusa and the whole notion of losing your head. And so the bottom line is, and the moral of the story is, and the advice is, do what you can to not lose your head at this time. So I'm going to leave that there. If you want to do further research on your own, by all means, have at her. But I'm going to move on and talk a little bit more about some other pieces of the puzzle here. So eclipses always happen in these cycles. And so every 18 years, we will have eclipses on the same axis, where the north node will be in the same sign as it was 18 years ago, and the south node will be across the sky in the same sign it was 18 years ago. And then halfway through the cycle, at the 9-year mark, the eclipse is happening in the same signs, but with the nodes in opposite, right? And so I looked back at when the last set of eclipses happened on the Taurus Scorpio axis, which is where we're headed here. And I think I mentioned to you already that this particular eclipse is sort of this transitional eclipse, because it's just, you know, it's giving us insight. It's illuminating, right? That full moon, it's illuminating our trajectory. It's illuminating the path ahead, being a full moon here, that we can kind of expect for the next 18 months. It's giving us some clues if we're paying attention. But then the story on the Sagittarius Gemini axis is still wrapping up, right, at this point in time. And so there's overlap here, and that tends to be what happens. So anyways, this last set of eclipses on the Taurus Scorpio axis happened, well, there was one set between 2002, 2003, and then further back, 1994, or 93, 94, if you were around back then, right? So if you think back to your own experience and what was going on, during those years at, you know, if you can remember some significant events that happened that relate specifically to Scorpio Taurus, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, and to the axis that that hits in your chart. So the houses, right, and the life themes that it speaks to. We're going to talk more about that as well when I go through all 12 signs. But if you do that, you can kind of get an indication of similar themes that are likely to play out. It's like the next chapter in that story that is likely to play out for you over the next 18 months, right? That doesn't mean the exact same thing is going to happen. I know personally for me, when I looked at this, I did have a bit of a moment of astrological anxiety, I have to admit, because at the time of, you know, those years when those eclipses were happening in my own life and that of my husband's, there were some pretty intense occurrences. But there were also some pretty positive occurrences as well, right? So, and the thing is we have to keep in mind, like, not all of the astro is exactly the same. So there were other things. Those eclipses were happening, yes, on the same axes in our charts, but there were other things going on at that time that aren't the case now, right? So if you look back and you panic because, you know, something bad happened around then, well, you know, two things to keep in mind. One is that you are very, you know, it's very unlikely, pretty much nil, that the exact same thing's going to happen in the exact same way, you know. And also the astro is not identical, right? So the eclipse axis is the same eclipse axis triggered, but there are other factors at play as well that can switch things up. But it's still good and interesting to get a kind of idea of the areas of life that were being impacted and that were changing, really, because eclipses bring turning points, right? They bring changes in directions. It's like a plot twist, right? An eclipse comes along and it's like plot twist. Oh, this is what we're doing now, kind of thing, right? So that's how that works. So look back, and when I looked back, I noticed that just in general terms, you know, when we're talking about sort of the world, the eclipse that happened on November 18th in 1994 was a lunar eclipse at 26 degrees of Taurus. So that eclipse happened at almost the exact same degree as this one is happening. And it was obviously also conjunct fixed star Algol, right? And so when we look to worldly events at that time, we had violence in the Gaza Strip, we had war in Bosnia, we had some major weather events, that kind of thing that went on around that time. And then in 2002 and 2003, November 20th, 2002 specifically, there was an eclipse at 28 degrees of Taurus. So also very close to the same point in the sky as this one. And one of the things that really jumped out at me when I was looking at world events at that time was we had the first news of the SARS outbreak at that time. So, you know, we may get some news about, you know, COVID and what's happening with that, or, you know, I don't know, but I thought that was interesting to note. So other things of note that are related to this particular eclipse are that, first of all, the moon is actually exalted in Taurus, meaning that the moon loves to be in Taurus. The moon is very comfortable in Taurus. The moon is revered and, you know, treated very well in Taurus, put on a pedestal sort of thing. And so, you know, when a planet is exalted in the sign of its exaltation, then that tends to bode well. And then the other thing is that the ruler of this eclipse is Venus, right? Because Venus rules Taurus. Venus also rules Libra, but in this case, Venus is the ruler of Taurus. And Venus is in Capricorn and preparing to retrograde there in Capricorn, and will be in Capricorn until like early March. Can't remember the exact date. I want to say March 6th, but so Venus in Capricorn is like the archetype, like I envision Venus in Capricorn as an archetype is like the matriarch, right? Who is responsible and is controlled and is measured and is in it for the long haul. Um, Venus in Capricorn can show us sort of where and how we need to be more responsible in terms of our resources and our relationships, even. Venus in Capricorn really, has ambition as well. Capricorn is an ambitious sign. And so Venus in Capricorn, it means business kind of thing as well. And it's very, in some ways, very traditional. Venus in Capricorn, people that have Venus in Capricorn tend to gravitate, all things being equal, gravitate towards sort of a more traditional lifestyle or partners, that kind of thing, right? So we've got this matriarchal Venus going on, ruling this eclipse in Taurus and Scorpio. So let's talk about Taurus and Scorpio just a little bit. I've talked about this in the past because we've been talking a lot, about the planets in Scorpio. It is Scorpio season. We just had the new moon in Scorpio. I talked a lot there. We've got the Uranus opposition in Taurus. So I've spoken to this axis before, but it's always good to remind ourselves, what is this about? Taurus and Scorpio is this axis that sort of deals with our security. I think of it as our internal and our external security, our emotional, our emotional, psychological kind of sense of security, which is Scorpio, and our more material security, right? So things like our resources and our like the material world, things like our personal belongings, our finances, the land, anything involving the earth and what comes from the earth, supply chains, this kind of thing. So this is an axis that very much deals with that kind of thing, and it deals with resources, and it deals with our need to feel stable and secure. Taurus and Scorpio are both fixed signs. Left to their own devices, they don't love change. That's not to say they can't change, but they're slow to change, and they like to make sure there is, purpose to that. They are not going to just kind of jump in with both feet, right? And generally, when we have energy in the fixed signs, it's a little resistant to the plot twist that wants to happen. Whereas opposed to like energy in the mutable signs, they are much more able to kind of transition, because that's what they signify, as the transition between the seasons. So they're comfortable in that energy. But with the fixed signs, the transition can feel abrupt, like for example, say, a massive snowstorm in the season when snow's not supposed to happen, right? That just kind of like throws in your face, here's winter. And I'm thinking of this because we're in Scorpio season right now, and we are, where I live, we've had a weather statement issued where we may be expecting a lot of snow or freezing rain tonight. So it's quite nice out right now. We've had quite a nice fall, a little bit wet, but quite nice. And so we could get this jarring, like, oh, here we are, right? In the fixity of Scorpio season and the fall where I am right now, and we could get this kind of like sudden jolt of, nope, now it's winter happening, potentially. That's just, one way to illustrate that sense of like, the fixed signs not necessarily loving the plot twist. So it can be a bit more jarring. So all that to say that it's likely that over the next 18 months, we will see some changes in direction in terms of our relationship to security, right? Our emotional security, our material security, these kinds of things. Does that mean it's going to be bad? Nope. Change is not necessarily bad. Change is often very necessary. And in fact, I would argue always necessary, because if things don't change and evolve, they stagnate and die. So we need change to happen. And if we are open to that, then it tends to be a little less jarring, right? For us. If we are holding on tight and resisting, as Scorpio and Taurus can sometimes have a tendency to do, then it can be a little more difficult, and the universe can come along and just kind of like pry that out of your hands and be like, it's time to let go of this now, right? We're moving on and we're doing this a different way now. We're doing this, right? So something to be mindful of. So I think that's about all I have to say. You know, we're going to see something illuminated around this time that is calling for our attention and sort of going, you know, over here, this is the way we're going now, right? This is the North Node, and I guess that's one more piece that I should probably address that I haven't talked about yet. The North Node is moving into Taurus. The North Node is what, it's kind of like what's calling us forward. The way things they're unfolding, you know, you can think of it in some ways as what's ahead, whereas the South Node is where we've been there, done that, you know, about the t-shirt kind of thing. It is the South Node is what we need to release, what we are being called to. You know, we've learned those lessons, we've got some good intel and some good information, and we've picked up some mad skills in that department. And now, what are we going to take forward with us, and what don't we need anymore as far as that goes, right? And the North Node is like, okay, this is the direction we're moving. So that's one perspective. But there's another way to look at the nodes as well, from a more sort of traditional perspective, or even a more, like when we're talking about Vedic astrology, Indian astrology tends to look at the nodes as what we call Rahu and Ketu, or the head and the tail of the dragon, right? And so the North Node is seen as this energy of something that can be all-consuming, and we can develop this voracious appetite for, like, and end up in the realm of the hungry ghosts, right? To borrow a phrase of from Gabor Mate. But it's like, you know, we just are so obsessed that we're kind of so focused on getting that and moving in that direction that it can be all consuming, and we just can never get enough of it. Whereas the South Node is something that is more of, you know, what is needing to be released, or where we can, things can be like, sort of lost, like let go of, right? That sort of thing, if that makes sense to you. So those are what the nodes signify. And so when we've got the North Node moving into Taurus, you know, it's a two-sided coin. It's like, on the one hand, we are being called to focus on those Taurian things, like stability, like our material stability and security, on the earth and what the earth needs, on what, you know, what comes from the earth and how we treat the earth and nature, right? Taurus is a sign related to nature. but also to our attachments and what we are like really gripping to that is not really serving us. So on the one hand, we're being called to pay attention to all those things. In another way, though, if you look at it from the more traditional perspective, that can be an all-consuming venture, right? We can get so caught up in that it's all we think about. It's all consuming, right? This material world is all consuming. And sometimes that's, those things happen because we are just driven, we want more and more and more, and it's never enough for us to feel secure and stable. And sometimes it's the hand of fate, and it's the fact that that's where we are forced to put all of our attention because, Taurus is kind of the sign that's related to getting our basic needs met and basic survival. And so sometimes, some folks don't have the privilege to not be solely focused on that. So I think that's important to remember. And then there's the Scorpio South Node piece where we are releasing or being called to let go of or move away from, certain kinds of power dynamics, which is Scorpio, certain emotional attachments, and maybe intimate even connections potentially with Scorpio, or things that are in the dark, secrets, obsessions, compulsions, truths. What else could I say? So something that just comes to mind here, I feel like this is going to be a long video, but it's important to talk about these things. Something that comes to mind here, and I'll try to make it brief, is we were having a conversation with a couple of close friends over the weekend. We were celebrating a good friend's 50th birthday. And so anyways, the four of us were having this conversation, and yes, there was some wine involved. I'm going to be honest with you, Algol. And so anyways, the good thing is that the dynamic between the four of us is such that we can have some really solid, truthful discussions and debates, and sometimes it can get a little like heated even, but it's like we respect each other's opinions and minds and all of that, right? And so this is kind of like dynamic conversation that was happening, and we all kind of thrive on that. So it was okay. But one of the things that was being brought up in this conversation was that, like, yes, there is, like, let's just, like, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. Let's just put it that way. But, if we just focus all of our attention on that, like, that's not being productive, right? So, definitely, like, that's something to be mindful of. And that's the Scorpio South Node piece that I'm talking about here. That's why I'm bringing this up. But also, we can't completely just let that go, because once again, you can't heal what you refuse to acknowledge, right? Like I mentioned earlier. So there's this kind of like balance here, and this fine line, right? Between those energies. And so that's something to keep in mind. Anyways, let's take it through the signs. I want to tell you that if you have planets or significant points in your chart, like, so if you have, your sun, your moon, your rising sign, a cluster of planets, or even a personal planet, Venus, Mars, what have you, or your, one of the angles, so your IC, you know, which is the bottom of your chart, or your MC, the top of your chart. If you have any of those planets or points around 27-ish degrees of the fixed signs, right? So namely Taurus, Scorpio, Leo, and Aquarius. So 27 degrees, give or take 3-5 degrees on either side of that. Then you are, you know, likely to feel this quite potently. And potentially it could be a bit tense, right? But it could also be very dynamic. And, you know, remember I said to you, because this will be either conjunct or opposite or square your placements. And so there can require some action here and some real fortitude, right, to move through this energy, but it can be quite potent as well. So I wanted to mention that to you. And then I also wanted to say that if you have planets around the 27 degree, give or take, again, 3 to 5 degrees sort of on either side of Capricorn or Virgo, or even 27 of Cancer or Pisces, then this is a little bit of an easier go on you. Again, all things being equal, because there will either be like trining those planets, right? A trine is a conversation of ease and flow and harmony, or a sextile, which is like a friendly conversation as well between the planets. So if you've got that going on, this may be a little bit less tense for you. But again, that's all things being equal, because I don't know what else is going on in your chart, right? These are general forecasts, so keep that in mind. And if you know your chart specifically, then you can look at the specifics. But if you want to get the most accurate information from these horoscopes, then listen for your rising sign first and foremost, right? Your rising sign, your ascendant. Because that will give you the most sort of accurate picture of what dynamic is playing out for you. But then you can also listen for your sun sign and your moon sign, because those will give you sort of added nuance, right? Added like sub chapters in the story kind of thing that's going on for you right now. So, but definitely listen for your rising sign. And I'm going to say, you know, don't skip the intro, because gosh, there's always so much info there. And I spend a long time pondering what to talk about. And then I often go off on tangents that I hadn't even thought about when I was taking notes. But anyway, it's always better if you listen to the intro, because if you don't, you miss the context, and then the actual little snippet that I say about your sign will not necessarily, you know, hit home as much. Okay, so let's take it through the signs now. And we're already approaching the hour mark, so I'm going to try to keep it brief. I do suggest that if you haven't listened to the Scorpio new moon video that I did a couple of weeks ago, that you listen to that. And again, I'll be back in a couple of weeks to talk to you about the Sagittarius eclipse that's coming up, which is a new moon, right? In a couple of weeks on December 4th. So I'll be back in 2 Wednesdays to talk about that. So let's take it through the signs. And we are going to start in this instance with Taurus. And that is because obviously Taurus, this is your eclipse, and you have the moon sitting in your sign, and you've got the North Node very close to the moon, right? Even though the North Node is in Cancer, it is heading into your sign. And so the story of the North Node is all about Taurus for the next 18 months. So that is very significant. And this particular lunar eclipse, right, full moon, lunar eclipse, is happening in your first house opposite your 7th house. So the sun is across the sky in the 7th house. And this is the axis of one-to-one close relationships. So relationships with significant others, with important people in your life, you know, business relationships, business partnerships, family members, those kinds of things. Anybody that you kind of have this close relationship with. And it can also include rivals. in the 7th house, which is, you know, rivals that we are aware of. So, you know, our competitors, that kind of thing that we are aware of. And it can also, when we're talking about the 7th house, which is where the sun is sitting for you over in Scorpio, it also speaks to, you know, your, to any contracts and agreements that may come your way as well. So we have this dynamic playing out on the first 7th house axis. So a call to potentially, you know, focus a little more on the self. That's first house, where the moon is sitting for you. And there may be something culminating there. There may be a bit of a plot twist that's happening. That's just kind of, you're getting the first inklings of around this time of this eclipse, that is in relation to you and your physical, even appearance, or your physical vitality, your body, how you interact with the world, you know, how you interface with the world, sort of thing, how you present yourself to the world, how the world perceives you. The first house is like us. It's, you know, it's all about you as a person and your life. And so it can be quite profound when we have things going on in the first house. And so, and this can impact relationships, the relationships in your life, and the relationship you have to yourself as well, right? We can't forget that. And so, you know, this may be a time of endings and beginnings in relationships. Keep an eye on the people that are moving, you know, into your awareness around this time, and maybe things that are coming to a close in terms of relationship for you. And you've also got this energy of Aquarius, or sorry, of Jupiter in Aquarius up there in your 10th house, right? That's the Jupiter piece. So Jupiter, the great benefic, is moving through your 10th house of career, of legacy, of ambition, of your personal, your public life, rather, your relationship to authority and people in authority. And so, and your own authority. And so there's something going on there with Jupiter in Aquarius, and in a square, like I mentioned in the introduction, with this eclipse. And so it can, you know, there can be any of those significations where we've got Jupiter that is uplifting and, you know, really growing things and making things abundant, or it can also be where things get overblown, or things go over the top, or we have our expectations are overblown in some way, shape, or form, right? So that's just something to be mindful of. But so those are the areas of life that are being triggered for you with this eclipse. And there is some larger story that is just beginning to unfold, that will continue to unfold for you over the next 18 months, in relation to this axis of relationship, right? Of the self and other. So that's what I've got for you, Taurus. I'm going to move on to Aries now, where Aries, for you, this eclipse is hitting your 2nd house. So the moon is in your 2nd house, and the sun is across the sky in your 8th house, right? And then we've got the nodes just about to tip into Scorpio, Taurus, on this axis for you. And so this is triggering the very first inklings of some new story, some new chapter, that will play out over the next 18 months in relation to your personal resources, right? Which is the 2nd house, where the moon in Taurus is. Your time, your money, your energy, how you get your basic needs met, your sense of self-worth, the things that you value in life. That's all 2nd house. And opposite, the 8th house, which is other people's resources, other people's time, money, energy, your partners. It can be resources that come from, you know, partners' income, or it can be, you know, money that goes in, comes in or goes out, in relation to taxes, wills, inheritance, debt, loans, scholarships, all those kinds of things, right? And the 8th house is your entanglements in general with other people and even institutions, and our sense of like emotional security, right? This is kind of related to that axis of, it's this axis of security in some ways. It's the axis of material form, which is the second house, and this notion of sort of transformation, which is the eighth house, right? And so this is the axis that's being triggered, and this is the story that is beginning to unfold for you, right? This new chapter on this second eighth house axis is starting to play out. You're getting the first inklings of what that's about for you around the time of this eclipse, and that will continue to play out for about a year and a half. And then you've got Jupiter in your 11th house, right? And Jupiter in the 11th is speaking to themes of the group, of friendships, of organizations, associations, of benefactors and supporters and allies, of your hopes and dreams for the future. So that's Jupiter there, and Jupiter's in square here. So, we talked about what that means in the introduction. So if you've skipped the introduction, please go back and listen to that, and you'll get more insight and further intel kind of thing. So look for those themes and what's kind of being triggered in association with those themes around the time of this eclipse, and consider what this new trajectory is about for you, and what you're being sort of called to move towards and called to release in some ways as well, right? In relation to those second eighth house themes, that notion of resources. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Pisces now. Pisces, for you, we've got the eclipse happening in your third house. And so, the moon is sitting in your third house, and the north node is about to tip into that house for you, because that's where Taurus sits. And then you've got the sun across the sky in the ninth house. And so this eclipse in Taurus is triggering some kind of a culmination or illuminating something that has to do with things that revolve around communications, right? This is third house. So your daily communications, even technology, it can have to do even with vehicles in the third house. The third house is like sort of what is swirling around, our immediate environment kind of thing, and including the people. So the third house speaks to siblings, cousins, neighbors, teammates, peers, these kinds of things. And like I said, our communication, it can speak to education as well. And usually in the third house, we're talking about like, anything that kind of goes up to high school, or anything where you're learning the basics, or teaching in that regard. So that's the third house. And then the ninth house on this axis of communication and the mind as well. The third house we think of as sort of like the lower mind. That's not derogatory. It just means like, our thoughts, our perceptions, our communications, the information exchanged back and forth, that kind of thing. And then the ninth house we think of as also having to do with communications in some way, but it's like higher minded things, like higher education, for example, college, university, or graduate programs are things that are like beyond, we're learning beyond the basics, even if it's outside of those traditional educational institutions. It is about expanding our horizons, whereas the third house is about our sort of immediate environment. The ninth house is what's beyond that, right? The people, the ideas, like our worldview, and how that's impacted through things like travel, or, being in contact with people who have different ideas and perceptions, or come from different cultures, or these kinds of things, or learning something new in some way. Speaking our, what we know, and our wisdom is very ninth house as well, teaching, that sort of thing, publishing. So for you, Pisces, all of these, themes here are implicated over the next 18 months with this eclipse, these eclipses moving through Taurus and Scorpio for you, which are those houses that I just spoke to. So pay attention to what's unfolding right now, and to what is perhaps coming up to be released, or what turning point is happening, what plot twist is indicated, what is being illuminated around this time, around those those themes, right? And then you've got Jupiter in the 12th house up there, which is the Jupiter piece that I spoke to in the intro. So I'm not going to repeat myself here. Definitely listen to the intro. But in square to this third, ninth house is sitting in your 12th house of sort of what goes on behind closed doors. It has to do, sometimes the 12th house is like what we can't see, our blind spots, you know, sometimes it's like our self-sabotaging behaviors. It can be things like how we spend time in rest and recuperation, our downtime, vacation time, even like healing in some kind of an environment that revolves around that, or things that are, you know, coming to an ending or a close as well, can be 12th house related. Or your spiritual life and your spiritual and mental health can be 12th house related. So that's where the Jupiter piece is heading for you. So that is what's happening for you, Pisces. And I will leave you with that and move on to Aquarius. Where Aquarius, this eclipse in Taurus is hitting your 4th house, right? Across the sky from the sun in the 10th house. So this is the axis that is being highlighted for you over these next 18 months with the eclipses on this axis in Taurus and Scorpio. So right now, there is something being illuminated that is calling your attention to, like, here's the trajectory for, you know, in this realm of life for the next 18 months. This is where the plot twist is happening. And so for you, Aquarius, that speaks to themes of home, family, roots, place of living, sort of nurturing figures in your life, parental figures, real estate, and your emotional security as well. And then across the sky in the 10th house, this is about, you know, our public life as opposed to our private life in the 4th house. So our public life and our careers and our worldly ambition and the legacy that you wish to leave behind, whereas the 4th house is the legacy that has been left to you. And then, you know, the 10th house also speaks to authority and authority figures and our relationship to that, right? And our own authority as well. So these are the themes that are being triggered for you. So think about, you know, what are you noticing in your life around this time that seems to be calling for your attention? What seems kind of maybe fated or synchronistic, or what is outworn and outdated that needs to be left behind so that you can move on to a new chapter as far as these themes go. And then you've got Jupiter in Aquarius in your, obviously your 1st house, Aquarius, because I'm speaking to you. And so that Jupiter is bringing this sense of, in some ways it can be, you know, upliftment, buoyancy, abundance, in relation to you, yourself, which is the 1st house, your personal, you know, how you come at the world and interface with the world, your appearance, your physical vitality, your relationship to yourself. So, but also there can be a tendency maybe to overdo things here with Jupiter there, and to maybe have too high expectations. Maybe you have too high expectations of yourself. That's possible. Maybe you are overdoing it physically. You know, that's something just to watch for with Jupiter there as well. But generally, you know, Jupiter is a benefic planet, and so it's there to help. And I spoke to all of that in the intro, so don't skip the intro, definitely. So I'm going to leave that for you, Aquarius, and I'm going to move on to Capricorn. And Capricorn, for you, the eclipse is hitting your 5th, 11th house axis. So you've got the moon in Taurus in your 5th house, close to the North Node, and you've got the sun in your 11th house in Scorpio, close to the South Node. And so what does this mean? Well, it means that this eclipse is showing you the way, or is illuminating something, the trajectory, so to speak, for the next 18 months as it relates to themes of 5th house. So this is your children, or just issues around children in general. It's how you have fun in life, what brings you pleasure and joy, your hobbies. It can have to do with sports. It can have to do with your creative projects and self-expression, entrepreneurship, you know, romance, all of these themes fall into the 5th house. And anything around children as well, which includes, you know, pregnancy. So that's the 5th house piece. And then the 11th house, where the South Node will be for the next 18 months, speaks to the group. It speaks to friends, associations, allies, supporters, your hopes and dreams for the future, you know, and the people that can help you get there, sort of thing. So these are the themes, right? It's your kind of your personal creativity, if you will, and collaborations with others in some ways. And sometimes, like, I often see this play out, especially if you're somebody, you know, if you're a parent, sometimes this plays out as your kids and their friendships or their groupings and that kind of thing. I've seen that happen. So that's something to keep mindful of as well. So nevertheless, these are the themes being triggered for you at this eclipse. And like I said, it's a full moon, right? Eclipse. So it is a point of culmination or something reaching ahead. There's a turning point happening here. And these energies will continue to unfold for the next year and a half. So listen to the introduction, please, for all of the pieces, because if you're just listening to this, it's just really not going to give you everything that you need to go on. And you also have Jupiter in the 2nd house for you, squaring this eclipse, Capricorn. And so that can speak to things like, without going and, you know, repeating everything I already said in the intro, but you know, the 2nd house has to do with our personal resources. So your money, your time, your energy, you know, so Jupiter there can be a time where things are abundant in those areas, and, you know, uplifting and positive and all of those benefic things. Or, you know, Jupiter can cause you to overspend and to be overly optimistic when it comes to those things too. So like I said in the intro, just keep your expectations in check as far as that goes. Okay, so we're going to move on to Sagittarius now. Sag, for you, eclipse is hitting your 6th and 12th house axis, right? So something is transpiring around this time in relation to those themes, which I'll mention what those themes are in a second. But this is this point where, you know, that there starts to be the turning of the wheel and the story starts to shift somehow in relation to these themes. And this story will continue to play out over the next 18 months, right? As we have the eclipses in Scorpio and Taurus. And so for you, that relates to 6th house, which is Taurus for you. And that is your daily routine. That is your health and wellness routines, right? What we do on the day-to-day, which can impact our health and wellness. It has to do with taking care of business. And it's like the nose to the grindstone kind of stuff that we have to do on the day-to-day, those mundane chores and the checking off the ticky boxes and, you know, the labor that we put in, whether it be paid or unpaid. So this can have to do with actual like work at a job, or, you know, that you're paid for, or it can have to do with work in some other way. And it can have to do with how you are in service. And it can have to do with, you know, your, like I said, your health in some way. And also the 6th house speaks to the realm of pets as well. So that's something you know, that may impact you if that's, you know, if you have pets or somebody even who works with pets or that kind of thing. So, and then across the sky, you know, in the 12th house, this can also speak to health. 12th house is more related to themes of spiritual and mental health, and our kind of how we may sabotage ourselves and our blind spots, you know, that we may not acknowledge or see or be aware of, and things that are sort of in our kind of unconscious. It can be our spiritual life. It can be endings in the 12th house. It's the last house, right, on the zodiac wheel. It can be related to even rest and retreat and how we recover from things, you know, and convalescence and all of that. So even like vacation can be 12th house, but so can like a hospital stay be 12th house, or, you know, any place that's sort of tucked away from the world can be very 12th house. So that's the axis that's being triggered for you, Sag. And then you've got Jupiter in the 3rd house, right? Which is the house of your immediate environment. So, and the people in it. So, you know, it's about communications that you have on the day-to-day, and even the vehicles of communication. You know, it is learning and teaching at a basic level kind of thing, up to kind of high school level, and even like the 101 kind of learning and teaching. It is people like your siblings and your cousins and your peers and your neighbors, you know, those kind of folks. It is also your thoughts and ideas and your mental processes, you know, even your excuse me, your self-talk. These can all be 3rd house related. And then you've got, you know, this tension playing out there between this Jupiter and that eclipse. But as I mentioned in the intro, Jupiter is a great benefic. And so even in tension, Jupiter tends to not be so harsh on us, right? But there can be, there's a possibility of Jupiter overdoing it here. So in relation to those 3rd house themes, I spoke to that in the intro. Definitely listen to the intro, and then you will get the full picture. So that's what I've got for you, Sagittarius. I'm going to move to Scorpio now, where we have the eclipse playing out on your 7th and 1st house axis. Excuse me. So Scorpio, for you, this, just like Taurus, is hitting the relationship axis, right? But only in reverse. And the eclipses are moving into your 7th and 1st houses. So you've got Taurus in your 7th house, right? And as a Scorpio rising, particularly. And so this is about the other. It's the partnerships in your life. It is, you know, any kind of significant people that you interact with. So it can be a significant other, you know, marriage partner, any kind of relationship that you have that's with a significant other person. It can be family members, close friends. It can be business partners. And the 7th house also speaks to contracts and agreements. And so, and it can speak to rivals too. And usually it's like open rivals, like rivals, you know, we're in competition with, that we're aware of. And so with the North Node moving into Taurus very soon, and this eclipse happening here on the 19th, this initial eclipse on this axis, we have the first inkling happening of what is the trajectory that we are headed on in terms of this relationship axis, right, in our lives over the next 18 months. So you will get some clues there. Something will be illuminated. Something will reach a peak around that time of the full moon, of the lunar eclipse in Taurus. And it is speaking to, you know, the other in relation to the self, right? Obviously you are the self. And so there's this idea here where with the South Node moving through your 1st house, it may be a time when you're focusing a little bit less on yourself and your own sort of needs, and a little bit more on that of your partners or of the other people, significant people in your life. Or there's a lot of focus on a contract or something like that that's going on over this period, right? And a little bit less focus that's going on in terms of like other people. Or sorry, that's going on in terms of yourself. And then you've got Jupiter in your 4th house that's squaring this energy, which I talked about, you know, what that means in the intro. So definitely listen to the intro. But your 4th house is home, family, roots, place of living, emotional security, you know, real estate, these types of things. Nurturing, sort of, I mean, not necessarily nurturing. We hope they're nurturing, but parental figures as well, 4th house. But your family, you know, roots and all of that, and your ancestry. So Jupiter is there and playing a role somehow here in this particular eclipse. So if you want more intel on that, then definitely listen to the introduction. So that's what's going on for you, Scorpio. I'm moving on to Libra now. And Libra, you have this eclipse cycle is triggering your 8th and 2nd houses, just like it is Aries, but only in reverse. And so, because Aries is your opposite sign, right? And so for you, Libra, the eclipse is happening. Taurus moon is in your 8th house, right? Where the North Node is about to move into. And then the sun is in your 2nd house, where the South Node is about to enter. And so for the next 18 months, there is a turning point that's occurring. There is a plot twist happening. There is a new story unfolding in relation to these themes of 8th, 2nd house. What is that? 8th house is other people's resources, partners' money, resources that come through or are paid out in terms of taxes, wills, inheritance, insurance, debts, loans, scholarships, all of those kinds of things. And also your intimate connections and entanglements with other people, right? And so this can speak to like psychological sort of wounding and healing. It can speak to the skeletons in the closet, so to speak, when we're talking about the 8th house. It can speak to this notion of transformation, of the cycle of death and rebirth in the 8th house, as opposed to the 2nd house, which is about your resources, right? Your personal money, time, energy, what you value, what you place worth on, your sense of self-worth. That may be like that's sort of detangled, shall we say, from others, from your entanglements, which are the 8th house. And so this is the axis that's being triggered for you. So there's this story playing on. If you recall, I mentioned in the intro about eclipses that have happened on this axis in the past. So when you listen to the intro, and you can take note of that, and then you can go back and think in your own life, how were these themes triggered back then, and what lessons did I learn, and how can I like do it different this time, and that sort of thing. So and then you've got your 5th house being triggered by Jupiter there, and Jupiter is in a square to this eclipse, like we spoke about in the intro, so I'm not going to go through all the details again here. But Jupiter, right, is the great benefic, but also intention here with the eclipse. And this has to do with children, and any children that are your children or children you're associated with in some way. It has to do with how you have fun in life, what sparks joy for you, your hobbies. It can have to do with sports. It can have to do with there's the things that bring you pleasure. It has to do with your creative contributions too, your creative self-expression. And so that Jupiter piece can really be supportive in many ways and buoyant and uplifting, but it can also cause us to kind of overdo it and go over the top in relation to those themes as well, right? So that's something to be mindful of. So that's what I've got for you, Libra. And I'm going to move to Virgo now. So Virgo, my fellow Virgo risings, this eclipse is hitting our 9th and 3rd axis. So the Taurus moon, right, Taurus lunar eclipse is happening in the 9th house, and the North Node is just about to move into Taurus, so into your 9th house. And then we've got the sun across the sky at this eclipse in the 3rd house. And the South Node is just about to move into that house. And so we have this dynamic going on the axis of communications, 9th and 3rd house, of the mind, which speaks to 3rd house are things like, our thoughts, our ideas, our perceptions, our self-talk, our daily communications, even the vehicles of communication that we use, and the technologies, and the vehicles of travel that we use even as well, the modes of travel, right? And also things like teaching, learning, publishing. All of these come into play in terms of 9th, 3rd house. And the third house is sort of the more immediate associations to communications and travel and people, right? Whereas the ninth house is like the expanding of our horizons beyond the immediate environment and the immediate people that we are usually interacting with, or that are sort of on the same level as us, so to speak. And so the ninth house, which is where the eclipse is actually happening, and the North Node is moving into, is more about what we learn from other people who are different from us. It can be what we learn from travel, how we expand our horizons in that way, how we spread our own wisdom and knowledge, how we learn from others. It can be about our worldview, how we see the world. So there's some dynamic going on here that is playing out over the next 18 months, right? And right around the time of this eclipse, we're getting an inkling as to the trajectory and as to what we might expect over this next 18 months in terms of those themes. So keep your eye on that and think about your own life and think about what went on for you around those eclipses that happened in Scorpio and Taurus in the past that I mentioned in the intro. Don't skip the intro, definitely. And also there is this Jupiter in the 6th house piece. And Jupiter in the 6th house is an energy that is, Jupiter, the great benefic, is supportive and bringing us potentially some buoyancy and some exuberance and some upliftment and expansion, but it's in a square here. So it can also, we have to be mindful of not overdoing it, of not having, too high expectations like I talked about in the intro. So if you want more on that, definitely listen to the intro and it will help you. But those are the themes that we're looking towards. So this Taurus piece here in the 9th house is perhaps calling us to focus a little bit more on what is outside our immediate sort of environment, right? At this particular time. So that's for you, Virgo. I think I'm going to move on now. I'm losing my voice to Leo. So Leo, for you, excuse me. And I'm far from done recording today. So anyway, for you, Leo, you've got this eclipse happening specifically in your 10th house. So that's where the Taurus moon is sitting, and that's where the North Node is about to enter. But across the sky, right, you've got the 4th house. So it's hitting this axis, and the eclipses over the next 18 months will continue to trigger this axis of the 10th and the 4th house. Taurus is in your 10th house, Scorpio is in your 4th house. North Node in your 10th house, South Node in your 4th house. So you can listen to the intro for all the details and you'll be able to kind of get a better sense of what this all means for you. But essentially, your 10th house, right, is speaking to themes of your public life, your public persona and reputation, your worldly ambitions, the legacy you wish to leave, your career. I don't know if I mentioned that yet. Your relationship to authority and authority figures and to your own authority as well. And so there's a culmination point happening here, right? With this eclipse, there is an illumination happening, a turning point happening that is cluing you into the story that is now beginning to unfold for you in this area of life. And that also relates to the 4th house, which is where Scorpio sits, which has to do with home, family, roots, place of living, ancestry, real estate, emotional security, parents, that kind of thing. And so there is, these themes are involved in this story that's playing out as well. So if you look back to the eclipses that happened in the past on this axis, and I mentioned those and I gave you those years earlier in the intro, you may get a sense of like repetitive themes that are coming up for you, right? And what you might expect sort of this next chapter to entail uh, in relation to these themes. So the other piece I just want to mention is that you've got Jupiter in the seventh house in Aquarius that's squaring this eclipse. And I talked about the details in the intro as well, so I'm not going to belabor all of that again. But, you know, Jupiter in the seventh, right? The great benefic Jupiter in your seventh house of one-to-one close personal relationships. So this is something that is being a bit of a protector there in some ways. Jupiter is bringing maybe a sense of optimism and buoyancy and upliftment on the one hand, but it's in a square, so there's a bit of tension here. And Jupiter, you know, can have a tendency to over exaggerate, to to blow things up, to maybe make our expectations a little bit too much, too unrealistic. And so it's something that we want to keep our eye on at this time, right? So I think that's good to go on, Leo. And I'm going to move on to Cancer now. Cancer, for you, these eclipses over the next 18 months in general are hitting your 11th and 5th house axis. So same as Capricorn, but the opposite. Because the north and south nodes will be, you know, on the opposite ends for you. But generally, this eclipse in Taurus is hitting your 11th house, right? We've got this lunar eclipse in Taurus, full moon eclipse, hitting your 11th house. So something culminating, something being illuminated, and reaching sort of a turning point or a peak in relation to the group, 11th house. Friends, associations, clubs, networks, supporters, allies, your hopes and dreams for the future. These are all 11th house themes. So something is going on here that is involved in this eclipse story. And it is, you know, something to pay attention to, because it's giving us intel on what to expect over the next 18 months, over the trajectory, right, that is unfolding. And then we've also got the 5th house implicated here, because Scorpio is sitting in your 5th house. So there will be eclipses in Scorpio as well, right, hitting this axis and kind of working over these two opposite houses. And for you, the 5th house has to do with children. So that can be your own children. It can be children in your life in some way, shape, or form. It can be pregnancy. It can be, you know, your own creativity and creative projects and entrepreneurship in some way. It can be hobbies and special interests and things like sports. It can be what brings you joy in life, you know, the pleasurable things in life. And so these are themes that are also being triggered. So think back to the other eclipses that happened on this axis that I mentioned in the intro, so you can go back and listen if you missed that, and what was unfolding for you over that time in relation to these themes that I just spoke of here. And you can get a sense of, you know, what the storyline is here for you over the next 18 months. And then you've got the Jupiter piece sitting in your 8th house, right? Jupiter in Aquarius in your 8th house. So Jupiter is sitting in that house that speaks to things like other people's money, partners' money, also things like taxes, debt, wills, inheritance, bursaries, loans, scholarships, mortgages, all of those things. It speaks to your entanglements with other people, your intimate connections, your psychological sort of wounding and healing, this notion of like transformation, right? And so that's where Jupiter is sitting for you. And there is, in some ways, cause for optimism there, because Jupiter is the great benefic and it is protecting, right? In many ways, it is buoyant and uplifting and all of that, but it isn't square. So it's a tension, it's a conversation of tension. And I spoke in more detail in the intro about this, but it's kind of like the things to be mindful of are that Jupiter can overdo it, right? Jupiter can be to like just have too high hopes, or have like be overly exuberant, exuberant, be overly optimistic, these kinds of things. There could be overgrowth, so to speak, with Jupiter, when Jupiter is involved too. So it's just to be mindful of that piece. So, okay, we're going to move on now to last but not least in this very long video. We're talking to Cancer. No, not to Cancer. We just spoke to Cancer. We're talking to Gemini now. Sorry, Gemini. So Gemini, for you, you have this eclipse happening in your 12th house. And so this eclipse in Taurus is initiating an 18-month cycle that is unfolding in relation to your 12th house versus your 6th house, right? Because this is the Taurus Scorpio axis for you. And so this is where the eclipses will be hitting for the next 18 months. So the themes that are really triggered here are things like your health and wellness, right? So mental and spiritual health is very 12th house. How you spend time in rest, relaxation, recovery, recuperation, solitude, isolation. It can be about sort of releasing endings. It can be about your dream life in the 12th house. It can be, you know, and your spiritual life. It can be about sort of any places that are kind of tucked away from the world, so to speak. It is how we, in some ways, escape from the daily grind, right? In some ways. So because across the sky is the 6th house, which is the Scorpio piece for you. And so when eclipses happen in Scorpio over the next 18 months, they will be happening in your 6th house, which has to do with your, more your physical health, generally speaking, and the routines and your daily routines that can impact your health. It can have to do with illnesses. It can have to do with your daily work, right? And just like what you do on the day to day and all those checking off the ticky boxes things that we have to do in mundane life, right? And it can be, and sometimes the 6th house can be like the hard labor we do, that's not always paid, but sometimes it is paid labor. It's the work that you do, you know, through your work sometimes too. It is also how you are in service, right, to other people and to the world in general. And it can be about pets as well in the 6th house. So all these themes are triggered for you over this eclipse cycle, Gemini. And if you look back to the periods of time when eclipses happened in these same houses and in these same signs, and I mentioned that in the introduction, so you can go back and listen if you missed it, you can get a sense, right, of A, how personal this was for you, and B, like what kind of themes did it stir up? What is the new chapter unfolding sort of thing? What is the trajectory kind of thing for you in relation to these themes? And then you've got Jupiter in your 9th house. And Jupiter is squaring this energy and from Aquarius. And Jupiter is the great benefic. And I spoke about this and this square in greater detail in the introduction. So definitely listen to that. But Jupiter sitting in your 9th house is kind of like expanding your horizons. It is about the things that we can learn from people and places that are different from us. It is, you know, teaching and learning and sharing our wisdom, or learning from others. It can be publishing. It can be, I think I mentioned travel already. But it's just generally this sense of expanding your horizons and your perceptions in some way, shape, or form, your worldview, right? And so Jupiter is there, and Jupiter is supportive. It's the great benefic. It generally brings optimism and, you know, abundance and those kinds of things. But it is in this conversation of tension with the eclipse. So that can be a bit like where we've got our expectations are too high, or Jupiter can kind of like make things overblown or over exaggerated or over emphasized in some way, right? So that's just something to be mindful of when we're considering the Jupiter interplay here. So I think that gives you plenty to go on, and I'm going to wrap it up here at almost a minute and 40 or an hour and 40 minutes. So Thank you so much for joining me, and let me know how things play out for you. I'll be super curious to hear from you. Thank you for being here. Thanks for subscribing and sharing and commenting and all those good things. And I will see you in a couple of weeks' time to talk about the solar eclipse in Sagittarius that's happening in early December. Okay, bye for now. Take good care.